right, everybody. So yeah, as Lex said, my name is Jen Head. I'm one of the behavioral health providers at Connections, which if I know we have folks kind of from all across the country, it sounds like. So Connections is in northern Larimer County in Colorado. And so my pronouns are she, her. I'm coming to you for this presentation today from our office in Fort Collins, which is on the traditional and ancestral homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations and peoples. I do have the tendency to talk a little fast sometimes when I get excited, especially, so feel free to drop in the chat if you need me to repeat something or something like that. I know that I'm going to work on trying to be slow down, but sometimes that is my tendency. I'm really just excited and passionate about this topic. I know I've seen it a lot in my own life as well as the clients I've worked with, so I'm excited to get to share this with you today. So here's some of our goals for our time together. I hope we can go over kind of the definition of boundaries, what that includes, understand some different examples as it relates to common boundary violations people may experience, talk about some of the challenges of kind of what gets in the way for setting and maintaining boundaries, learn some strategies for setting boundaries. So I really have come to view boundaries as a form of self-care, and I define self-care as an active and preventive approach to attending to our own well-being. So it's just something I've noticed a lot with my own work and clients. So that's that. So a lot of what I pull from today, we will have a resource slide at the end. And so I'll list her book as well as some others. But I really like this quote from this author, Nedra Tawwab, who is a therapist in North Carolina. So she says, "People don't know what you want. It's your job to make it clear. Clarity saves relationships." So that comes from her book, Set Boundaries, Find Peace. And I really just appreciate her way of talking about boundaries. Her books, if you are interested, are very user-friendly. I feel like they have great examples. They're very clear to kind of read and can be really useful. She also has a very informative Instagram page if you are somebody who likes to use Instagram. And the big thing I want to say about boundaries is that boundaries really are meant to respect and preserve our relationships. May not feel that way sometimes to the people we're setting boundaries with, but ultimately boundaries are about wanting the relationship to be functional, to be healthy for everybody involved. So that's kind of my perspective on the boundaries. So we will have a brief little activity opportunity for you all to interact. So if you feel comfortable in the chat, when you hear the word boundaries, what comes to mind for you? You can say a word or a phrase, whatever comes to mind for you. Respect, comfort, consideration, protective walls, protection, self-protection, space, where I'm willing to go or not go, backyard fences, I like that one, authenticity, pause and listen, that's a good, invisible line, scary, yeah, that's true too, healthy relationship, self-respect, stop, peace, personal protection, dignity, honesty. Yep, great. Okay, so defining boundaries. So some of the folks in the chat kind of touched on some of these, right? Limits, what's acceptable, what's not acceptable for people that we're in relationship with. And I would say that boundaries are part of our communication patterns we have with others, even if we don't necessarily say them out loud or say them directly. It is still part of our patterns and what we do with others. Boundaries can look different from one relationship to the next. They can also change over time as we evolve and the people in our lives evolve. They don't necessarily stay static. And an example that we've kind of all been living through the last couple of years, regardless where you fall on the spectrum related to COVID precautions, I think that really brought up a lot of boundaries in terms of what we've felt comfortable with, what other people felt comfortable with. So that's a big example of what we've all been living with. And as I kind of said earlier, the purpose of a boundary is ultimately a tool for communication. It's meant to help our relationships. It's a way to communicate our wants and needs in an assertive way, and hopefully in a way that ends up with somebody meeting those needs, although we can't control that. It would be nice if we could control others, but the reality is we can kind of only control our side of the street. So a boundary is a way of kind of setting those standards for ourselves and the relationships we have. It can also help to look sometimes at boundaries as an opportunity. I know, like a lot of folks kind of touched on in the chat, sometimes boundaries or setting boundaries can bring up uncomfortable feelings or difficult or scary emotions. And I would invite you to encourage you to think about, sometimes boundaries can be an opportunity to build trust with people in our lives or build intimacy by better being known by them and sort of met in what we need with them. One of the things to consider, and we'll get into this a little bit more later in the slides, but is thinking about the people in your life you might want to set boundaries with, thinking about sort of what is the data you've gathered from your time with that person. Have they demonstrated that they're willing to hear feedback, or that they're open to changing their behavior? If they're not, that doesn't mean that we don't set boundaries, but it may be something for us to be aware of as we look at our own expectations of what we have for the relationship. So I like this silly little cartoon. If you don't know the Awkward Getty cartoonist, I think they have some great stuff. For the purposes of this talk, we're going to be focusing mostly on what I would say are external boundaries. So that would be the boundaries we set with others, but know that there are internal boundaries too that we sort of set with ourselves in terms of the limits for ourselves of what we think about, where we spend our energy, kind of the things that we can control internally. Those are internal boundaries. So an example, like this cartoon indicates, is thinking about maybe the use of social media or technology. Kind of if we know that using technology or social media a lot is not the best for our well-being, maybe an internal boundary is setting a limit of how much time we're going to spend scrolling Instagram or Facebook or Twitter or whatever it would be. And so this is also relevant when we think about the expectations we set with others as an internal boundary. So for example, if there's somebody we have a difficult relationship with, I had a therapist say once, how many times are you going to keep trying to hug a hot stove and not expect to get burned? And so I think I share that just because for me it was really useful in thinking about my own internal expectations and kind of boundaries for that specific relationship based on the data of what they had demonstrated of how I was going to approach future interactions with them. So that's what I mean by internal boundaries. So when we think about boundaries, or the lack thereof we might have, we could think about sort of where do some of these boundaries come from. A lot of them come from our childhood experiences, what we saw growing up in our family systems, thinking about were boundaries something that were respected? Pardon me, just a minute. Were boundaries something that were respected? Was it something if people set boundaries they were offended by? All of that can be really useful as we think about where our own feelings about boundaries come from. Boundaries are also shaped by the experiences we have as adults in significant relationships, whether that's romantic relationships, whether that is work relationships, friendships, the relationships we have with family members, any of those things. Also, there's definitely cultural considerations in terms of what our culture taught us about limits or boundaries. Those can be important too, as well as the impact of trauma and neglect. When we go through a traumatic experience or difficult experience, all of that stuff kind of shapes our sense of safety and our ability to communicate, our safety in expressing what we want or need or feel. All those things can be shaped, pardon me. Another aspect that really informs kind of our thoughts and feelings about boundaries is the idea that in our society in America, there can be a lot of value and emphasis on perfectionism, sort of achieving, hustling. And I want to acknowledge that sometimes there is a level of sort of hustling that is survival, right? Depending on our circumstance in life, we may be really needing to hustle and kind of do a lot and have a hard time setting boundaries or limits. But sometimes it can come from this place of sort of excessively striving or overachieving or feeling like things have to be perfect rather than thinking that things could be good enough. So I want you to take a minute to think, and you don't have to put this in the chat, but just think about for a minute who usually pushes your personal boundaries. So I'll just give you a second to think about that. And if anybody feels brave and wants to put it in the chat, you can. Yep, great. Coworkers, Yeah, usually there's a couple different categories of folks that tend to push our boundaries the most. There are coworkers, as somebody mentioned, or people at work, could be customers, could be bosses, family members a lot of time, yep, siblings, dogs you're babysitting, that could be a boundary pusher for sure. Children, yes, children, friends, church, on-call cell phone, yeah, a lot of folks sharing stuff. Students, yep, family, people closest. Yeah, acquaintances, close friends. Thanks for that. Yeah, so most of the time I would say our boundaries tend to be pushed by people that we have some kind of a relationship with, right? But there certainly can be circumstances where a stranger might push a boundary, and that can be different. I would say sometimes if we notice that strangers are pushing our boundaries a lot and we're getting a lot of big feelings with strangers, I would say sometimes that can be an indication that we may have a pattern with the people we are in relationship with that is also showing up with strangers. So thanks for that participation. Yeah, you touched on a lot of what I was gonna say. So then, looking at types of boundaries that we might have, there's kind of 6 different categories things might fall into. So physical boundaries, material boundaries, sexual boundaries, emotional, intellectual, and then time. And I will say that sometimes it can be a little tricky to differentiate between emotional boundaries and intellectual boundaries. What I mean by those is when it's an emotional boundary, it's something relating to our feelings, whereas intellectual would be something more related to our thoughts or beliefs or something along those lines. So as folks look at these different categories, any guesses of which type of boundary people tend to struggle with the most? So feel free to put in the chat any guesses of which type or category of boundary folks might struggle. Emotional, time, emotional, yep, yeah, all of them, yes, yes. Yeah, so a lot of folks saying emotional and time. I would say yes, those are the 2 big ones for sure. And time tends to be the one that a lot of people struggle with, but certainly any of these. And I would say, thinking for me as a therapist, a lot of times what brings folks into counseling is emotional boundaries, time boundaries, or any of the others for sure. All right, so then as we think about the kinds of boundaries we have, there's different ways we can communicate those boundaries. And again, these can vary from person to person or situation to situation. And some of them can be more or less effective depending on the situation. So a passive way to communicate our boundaries would be something that's kind of like hinting, like expecting somebody to read our minds, like she should know that I have a lot going on, with work. And so I can't, drop everything to help her move. Aggressive communication can look like demands, really uncomfortable, very kind of scary. Passive aggressive communication could look like, kind of denying our feelings, but then still kind of acting out in an indirect way, a little bit more aggressively. Manipulative communication would be one where maybe we're using kind of emotional tactics, kind of like guilt tripping, those kinds of things related to trying to communicate our needs. This can be sort of like trying to get somebody to feel sorry for us, and so they don't have the opportunity for saying no. And any of these ways of communicating, we may not be conscious that we're doing this. This is a lot of times just kind of what we grew up doing or watching. And then the fifth type of way to communicate our boundaries would be assertively. And so that's what kind of our talk is today, is trying to give some information and strategies or tips around assertive communication as the way to best and most effectively express our boundaries and also have them respected or met. And I happen to be a big fan of Brene Brown, and she always says, clear is kind. So that's what I think about when I think about assertive communication with our boundaries. So when it comes to the different levels of boundaries, there's three kind of main levels we could have with boundaries. The first one is what we would call porous or loose or weak boundaries. And kind of as this picture represents, there's parts of this fence that are sort of sturdy and maybe wouldn't fall down if we pushed on them. But then there's a lot of parts of this fence that are completely open or falling down or loose. And so this is kind of representation of what it looks like when we tend to have a pattern of a porous boundary. This can look like trouble saying no, engaging in people pleasing. It can look like having difficulty separating our emotions from somebody else's. Thinking you're responsible for fixing a situation or sort of caretaking of somebody. Can look like codependency. And a lot of times with folks that tend to have a pattern of porous behaviors, it can also look like difficulty in knowing, kind of being in touch with our own needs or our own wants, because we're so used to prioritizing others, thinking of others, that we can kind of get used to minimizing or denying our own wants and needs. A lot of times this can lead to resentment. This can lead to irritability, complaining, those different kinds of things. So another level of boundary we might have is a rigid boundary. Sometimes stereotypically this can be sort of a male pattern of boundary, but not always. It looks like not being very open or flexible, can be sort of self-protective to the extreme. Sometimes a rigid boundary develops because of very difficult experiences or traumatic experiences we've had. Can feel sort of closed off, like this brick wall sort of represents. It also can be that in maybe most relationships in our life, we have more porous boundaries. I would guess perhaps a lot of the folks on this call tend to have more porous boundaries, but maybe there's other times where it's more rigid. The other thing I would say is that sometimes we have porous boundaries with most people, but maybe there's one or two people in our life we have very rigid boundaries with because of some things that have happened. Also, sometimes as we start kind of shifting and trying to work on our boundaries and adjusting, if we've had a pattern of porous boundaries and are trying to work towards more kind of healthy, balanced boundaries, maybe sometimes we kind of swing to rigid for a little while as we're kind of working on figuring out what the middle ground could look like. So then this would be the third level of boundary, what I would call healthy or balanced. This looks like it's clear, it's direct, it's reasonably flexible, and it's more of this open-hearted approach. I really like this image because I feel like it sort of really symbolizes how with kind of a healthy boundary, we have some level of choice. So that's kind of what this gate symbolizes, right? We could close the gate, we can open the gate, we can even lock the gate for a period of time if we wanted to or needed to. What that might look like is maybe if there's something that happens with somebody, maybe we lock that gate and we take a break from talking to them for a little bit while we kind of take a beat to calm down, sort of collect our thoughts, come down from some big feelings, and then re-engage with that person. So that's sort of what what we're working towards. It's definitely easier said than done for sure, but this is kind of the image I encourage you to have as you work towards thinking about the kinds of boundaries you might want to have in your life. So then some examples of boundary violations. We talked about some of these categories earlier. So an example of a physical boundary might be as simple as somebody kind of standing too close to us in line. Could look like, as somebody who's had a baby somewhat recently, could look like somebody coming over and just picking up our baby without asking, without washing hands or different things like that. A physical boundary could look like maybe forcing our kiddos to go hug a relative or a friend if they're not comfortable. Material boundaries could be things like somebody who keeps borrowing our clothes and bringing them back dirty or torn or damaged. Could look like somebody who borrows our car and doesn't fill it up with gas, or borrows money and doesn't pay us back like they said they would. Emotional boundaries could be things like gossip around the office, maybe a coworker gossiping to you about another coworker, or a family gossiping about somebody's partner or something like that. Another emotional boundary that gets violated sometimes is maybe having a friend or a family member who is kind of constantly just kind of dumping or emotionally kind of venting and verbally processing, but not really wanting to make changes or do anything different, just kind of that dumping, and they're not asking us ahead of time if we have the time or space to kind of hear what's going on in their life. An intellectual boundary violation might be maybe somebody who keeps talking about politics, even though we don't agree on politics and don't want to discuss that with them. Time boundaries, there's a lot. This could look like maybe our boss that keeps calling or texting when we're on vacation. Could look like a friend who keeps asking for help at the last minute, or somebody who shows up at our door without calling, those kinds of things. So if you end up wanting to get some books, I feel like especially Nedra's books really goes into a lot of great examples, but I imagine most folks can kind of think of to themselves of some examples in their own life. And if we had a little bit more time and there weren't so many folks, maybe we'd have people share in the chat, but for purposes of time, I won't ask you to do that. And one of the things I wanted to kind of share before we get into more of the material is thinking about this concept of boundaries versus backpacks. So one of the books that will be in the resource page are books by two authors, Cloud and Townsend, and they kind of developed this topic of sometimes when we think about what boundaries we may or may not set with people in our lives, it can be useful to think about whatever it is they're dealing with. Is that a backpack level of difficulty that they're carrying, or a boulder level of difficulty that they're carrying? So if we have a friend, for example, who is constantly kind of asking for help and demands on our time and different things like that, is that kind of a one-time crisis that they're going through? You know, maybe they're going through a really difficult time and they're kind of in a little bit more of a crisis. They would say that's kind of more of a boulder, where maybe we don't have as rigid of boundaries with that, and we kind of do what we can to support that person during that crisis. Versus if it's more of a backpack of kind of the level of things that people aren't doing on their own, maybe that is a backpack that they really need to kind of get some support around being able to do for themselves rather than get our help around. Okay, so thinking of some of the common challenges, what are some of the things that get in the way for other people when we're trying to set boundaries? So first, I just want to acknowledge and kind of normalize that changes are really tough for everybody, whether it's us that's setting the boundary or somebody in our life we're asking to respect our boundary. As human beings, we're sort of wired to just like the usual and kind of like creatures of habit, be status quo. So just kind of naming that sometimes that is one of the first things that gets in the way. We're used to doing things a certain way. So then some common reactions people might have when we start establishing boundaries and setting limits with them. This could look like pushing back, defensiveness, maybe silent treatment. Maybe they just don't talk to us, they get mad. Maybe they test our limits with our boundaries. In extreme situations, that can also look like gaslighting. So if there's a really unhealthy dynamic going on, sometimes it looks like gaslighting. And for those who aren't familiar with gaslighting, that is a concept basically when somebody starts kind of trying to challenge the reality of what happened in a situation, sort of denying facts, denying our feelings, can sound like, I never said that, you're remembering it wrong. That would be sort of a more extreme version of a boundary kind of being pushed back on. But this is, I think, where it can be really useful to think about the person that you're setting the boundary with, sort of what you have noticed over your time of being in relationship with them. What is their ability? What is their capacity for receiving feedback for different things like that? Because if I think about, my toddler pushing back on a boundary, I think somebody said their kids as one of the people that pushes on boundaries. How I respond to my toddler pushing back on a boundary is going to look different than an adult in my family, right? Because their capacity is a little different for understanding kind of what is happening, what's going on. Another concept that I oftentimes kind of share with folks is the idea of the difference between the impact versus the intention of somebody's actions or choices, those kinds of things. So somebody may not intend to make us feel disrespected, by borrowing our clothes and giving them back torn and damaged and ripped, right? But the impact is that we are feeling kind of disrespected or taken advantage of, something like that, when they're doing that behavior. So sometimes if we start feeling defensiveness or pushback from folks, it can be useful to kind of keep that concept of impact versus intention in your mind, and maybe even share that with them of, hey, I know that you're not meaning to disrespect me when you bring back my stuff dirty, but that's how it's feeling to me. Because a lot of times if folks feel defensive or push back, they might kind of say, well, I didn't mean to do that. And we can acknowledge like, yes, I know you didn't mean to do that. And it still is kind of how I felt or how that impacted me. Another thing to consider is that sometimes people just don't know how to get their needs met in a different way. Maybe they don't have the communication skills or social skills to be able to communicate differently other than just last minute calling and asking for help or something like that. So if it feels like it's appropriate and you have the space, kind of emotionally the bandwidth to do that, maybe it's an opportunity to kind of talk with them about, hey, I want to help be there for you, but I need you to ask me differently or communicate that differently. So one of the things I want to kind of talk about when we think about what gets in the way, the common challenges we ourselves may feel when we're setting boundaries or thinking about setting boundaries, is that as humans, we're really wired for connection. Whether you tend to be more of an introvert or an extrovert, still kind of we're all on the spectrum of we're social creatures, the way we're wired. And so when we start talking about boundaries or setting boundaries, there really is kind of some reality that touches on kind of a biological need for us to feel safe and secure to the people in our lives. And so setting a boundary can risk that connection and can risk that safety or security. The other thing is that a lot of us who are socialized and raised as females, we're often socialized to be nice or agreeable. And so it can feel very countercultural to think about setting limits or saying no. Those can be really entrenched kind of values or norms, expectations that we carry from growing up in the world. Also, sometimes this is where our personal beliefs about the boundaries that we might have seen maybe in our families growing up or in relationships throughout our life, this is where we can sometimes hold these values where maybe we think a boundary is kind of mean or selfish. Those can be real things that create barriers for us to be willing to set a limit and set a boundary. Another thing too that sometimes comes up is that deep down it can sometimes get at our questions of self-worth. Sometimes we maybe wonder if we're really deserving to set boundaries, and that can kind of get in the way of setting those and doing those things. So getting into some sort of meat and potatoes, getting into some example scripts. And again, this is where some of the books that are listed on the resource page can be really useful. I meant to show, actually, these are two of the Nedra books that I think are really helpful. And this one especially, the workbook, is one that has a lot of the scripting. So if you feel like it might be useful to have some kind of a tool, this one can be a really useful one. So going back to kind of the original examples and categories of different kinds of boundaries, thinking about this friend maybe who asked us for help at the last minute. This could be an example of an assertive communication we could use. So I want to be able to help you when I can. I need you to ask me ahead of time instead of the day of when you want help with something. So it's short and sweet, simple. In this example, we're kind of starting it with this kind of bid for connection in a way of we're saying, like, it is important to me. I do want to help when I can. And here's the other thing. So a lot of times I'm a fan of trying to use the word and instead of but, because sometimes but can kind of feel like the other person that we're negating what we say. So if we were to say, I want to be able to help you when I can, but I need you to ask me, sometimes it can make the person think like, do they really want to be able to help or not? So instead saying, I want to be able to help you when I can, and I need you to ask me ahead of time. So it's clear, it's direct, it's expressing what we are asking expectation-wise of this friend. So in this example, we are asking that they call us ahead of time instead of the day that they need help. That could be different, depending on kind of what your life looks like. If you need a week notice or 2 days notice, whatever, it can kind of be as specific as you want, but it's trying to clearly communicate what the expectation is with them. And notice also in these examples that we're not explaining ourselves. Sometimes if we get into the weeds of explaining why we're asking for something, it can give off the sense that our boundaries are negotiable or that we're not as confident in them or something like that. So I would encourage to not really get into explaining why or defending yourself, just trying to be very clear and direct and simple. So the other example here is for the sibling who borrows clothes. If you borrow my dress, I expect you to get it dry cleaned afterwards, right? So again, that simple, clear, direct. A couple more examples. So for the example of the person who keeps talking to us about politics, I've asked you to stop talking about politics with me, so I'm going to hang up now. If you're someone like me, that can feel really, oof, that's rough, right? We can feel maybe some feelings about hanging up on somebody. But if it's something where you've communicated that boundary a couple times before, that could be a possible consequence of them not respecting the boundary. For the boss, the example of the boss who keeps contacting you on vacation, an example might be, I'll respond to this when I return to work on Monday. Ideally, maybe this would be an auto away message that we set, or maybe we don't even answer the phone, something along those lines. And again, depending on the situation, this may or may not be feasible, but I just want you to start thinking about kind of what are the parameters or limits you could set with people in your life that are pushing things. So if you are somebody who does need to be available even on vacation, maybe there is a limit of, they're not to call you after 9 o'clock, unless it's an emergency or something like that. in this example with work situations, things like that, maybe it is communicating. If this has been a pattern in the past when you've been away or had time off on vacation, maybe it's communicating before you go on your next trip. Hey, last time I went on my vacation, I noticed I kept getting a lot of calls and emails. Can we maybe go over what is getting done before I leave so we can try to prevent you needing to reach me while I'm gone? Something along those lines. All right, so remember, clear is kind, short and sweet is what we're aiming for when we are communicating our boundaries with folks. And also the process of setting boundaries is sort of two parts. It involves communicating them to people and then also reinforcing and maintaining them. So expect that you'll probably need to repeat yourself more than once most of the time. Again, going back to that idea that we're all kind of creatures of habit and tend to do what we're used to, just expecting that you're going to have to repeat yourself more than once in setting boundaries. I did want to touch on, too, the difference between consequences and ultimatums. So in that example I gave before about, if somebody keeps talking about politics, and the consequence is that we end our phone call with them, that is a consequence. That is, we've communicated the boundary to start with clearly, and then the person still doesn't respect it. And so then we choose what our consequence is. So in that situation, it was hanging up the phone. An ultimatum is usually a little bit weightier of a decision, and sometimes is more when there's kind of a lot more at stake. There's been a lot more violations in the relationship, things like that. And for both situations, whether there's a consequence or an ultimatum you're going to set with the boundary, I would just encourage that if you are going to say that there's a consequence or an ultimatum, you need to be prepared to follow through on that. Because that's where sometimes people get used to how we respond to their pushing our limits. And if they're used to us sort of giving in, not holding firm, then giving an ultimatum is probably not going to mean as much weight if they're used to us just giving in on that. So if you are going to give an ultimatum or a consequence with a boundary, be prepared to hold it. And again, that's easier said than done. And then also, I just encourage that change of any kind, whether it's boundaries or any other changes in our life, a lot of times can start with curiosity and awareness, especially if you are somebody who tends to have more porous boundaries. Maybe spending some time reflecting and kind of noticing, maybe even writing down where you need to set boundaries or want to set boundaries in your life. I'm a big fan of writing and journaling. Partly because when you journal or write, you can only write one thing at a time. So it sort of is a built-in way for us to slow down our thinking. But also it is a very tangible thing that helps us sometimes get clear on what patterns we've been experiencing, how things have been impacting us, things along those lines. One of the metaphors I sometimes share with clients is when we think about the people in our lives, and especially the people who push our boundaries or give us a hard time or that we have a hard time with, is I sometimes like to think of ourselves, kind of our well-being, our emotional health as a house. And so if we think about our well-being as a house, there's kind of different levels of intimacy and closeness we might have with people. So we could start with maybe there's some people who we aren't as close with, don't have as much connection to, and those are kind of folks that we can imagine being out on the sidewalk of our fence from that earlier slide. There's not as much emotional investment, there's not as much shared, but there is still some connection and relationship. Then there's maybe some people that are kind of closer to us that we can imagine sort of being in the living room level of our emotions and our sense of self, that we share more things with, more less private, a little bit more private things with, more intimacy. And then if we're lucky, we have a couple people who are maybe sort of bedroom level of friends or partners or people in our lives. But sometimes what happens is that over time, we have different relationships with different people, and maybe somebody started off as sort of a bedroom level of friend or family member, but over time, they have consistently shown they're not really a safe person to be at that level of intimacy or connection with us. And maybe they need to be moved to kind of more of the living room or maybe even the sidewalk. So I share that metaphor just in case it's helpful as you start thinking about the people in your life you want to change patterns or relationships with, that sometimes it can be useful to reflect on kind of which level of closeness and intimacy you've put them in. I've even sometimes had clients draw a house and sort of draw where the people are in their life right now and draw where they want them to be as sort of just a visual representation and kind of intention of what you want relationships to look like with folks. And sometimes the hard thing is that, like we said earlier, setting a boundary, sometimes people that we're setting that boundary with perceive that as a threat. And remember again that we can never control how they perceive something, how they respond. Those are all things that are their responsibility and their stuff to kind of own or work on. And the reality is that sometimes we set boundaries and it ultimately ends up in the relationship not working anymore or falling apart for a period of time. My encouragement to you is that sometimes if you experience setting a boundary and then losing the relationship, is that often it was kind of probably headed in that direction, which maybe can feel like a hard thing, but sometimes that is sort of the reality. And that's where I think the hard work of sort of figuring out our own internal boundaries, our own internal expectations, sort of knowing ourselves and being honest with ourselves about what we want and need can help with clarifying some of those boundaries you might want to set with folks. So to go through some strategies, hopefully these are some good kind of takeaway tools to think about as you start reflecting on some of those things. Practicing setting boundaries with the people in your life is maybe think about if there's ways you can start small. If you have a significant relationship that you feel a lot of pressure or discomfort around setting a boundary with, maybe there's some lower stakes, kind of lower emotional costs you can kind of practice. A somewhat silly example but can be helpful is if in general you have a hard time just with saying no, sometimes putting yourself in situations where you know you're going to be asked a question to practice saying no, like maybe going to a store that you know is going to offer to for you to sign up for a credit card. Maybe that's a small place you can start practicing. Or if there's other relationships in your life, like acquaintances or things where there's not as much kind of riding on the change, maybe those can be places you start practicing before getting to that bigger, harder one. Again, I'm a big fan of writing it down if it helps to write out your sort of script of what you might want to say and practice it out loud, practice it with a friend, practice it with a therapist, can be really useful sometimes. Also, in a lot of recovery communities, we use this tool called HALT. And HALT stands for hungry, angry, lonely, or tired. So we ask ourselves, do I need to halt? Am I feeling any of these things? Am I feeling hungry? Can I have a snack first? Am I feeling angry? Do I need to acknowledge that instead of deny that I'm angry? Am I feeling lonely? Do I need to connect with somebody? Am I feeling tired? Do I need to take a nap or try to rest or something like that? And sometimes practicing that HALT technique can be sort of the first step to taking care of our needs to get us in a better place, energy-wise, emotionally, to engage in the practice of setting boundaries. And then also, I'm a big fan as a therapist, obviously, of finding an accountability partner maybe for some support as you get ready to make boundary changes. Could be a friend that has given permission to kind of give you that space, could be a therapist, any of those kinds of things. And then also getting clear on the costs or the consequences of setting the boundary versus not setting the boundary. Maybe this looks like a pros and cons list of, how much is it impacting me to not set this boundary with this person? Is it worth the risk of them getting angry or something like that? Or does it feel like it's something I don't have to deal with right now. That's something that only you can kind of work on and identify. And then lastly, give grace. It's really hard to change, like I've said before. So giving grace to yourself, giving grace to others as much as you can, depending on the situation, just acknowledging that change is hard. And again, that this is where you kind of think about, who the relationship is and what it's worth to you as you kind of consider doing this hard stuff, because it can be hard sometimes. Sometimes people respond better than you expect, and other times it can be harder than you expect. So that's where I really feel like having some support and accountability partner can be really useful in the process of kind of maintaining that momentum in setting boundaries. So then lastly, one more quote from Nedra Tawwab. Remember, there is no such thing as guilt-free boundary setting. If you want to minimize but not eliminate guilt, try to change the way you think about the process. Stop thinking about boundaries as mean or wrong. Start to believe that they're non-negotiable part of healthy relationships, as well as a self-care and wellness practice. Right. So here is a resource page with some different books that can be useful if you're interested in kind of some additional self-guided kind of work on this process. As I said, Nedra has 2 different books right now. The first one, Set Boundaries, Find Peace. And then she more recently came up with the workbook that's really helpful with a lot of exercises, spots to fill in, example scripts, things like that. Another book that's useful is one by Anne Catherine, Boundaries, Where You End and Where I Begin. Cloud and Townsend that I mentioned earlier, their original book is this one called Boundaries, When to Say Yes, How to Say No to Take Control of Your Life. And then they have a couple different variations as well for different settings. So boundaries in relationships, boundaries with teenagers, boundaries with kids, I believe, and maybe a couple other ones. I will give the disclaimer that for the Cloud and Townsend, they do come from a more Christian worldview. So if that's not your jam, I would say maybe don't check those ones out. And then also Melody Beattie, as I mentioned earlier on, that sometimes when we tend to have a lot of patterns of porous behaviors, sometimes that can be an indication of some codependency, and Melody Beattie has some really great books and resources for kind of codependency in that particular thing. So lastly, it looks like we should have a few minutes for some questions if folks have some questions, but also you're welcome to reach out to me after this presentation. There's my email or my direct line, or if you're local in Colorado, Northern Colorado, you're welcome to call Connections. Our team is here Monday through Friday, 9 to 5 on the phone if you want help finding a local therapist, or even just kind of talking about if it might be useful to get connected with a therapist. So thanks so much. I'll go back to the resource page in case that's helpful, and then open up if anybody has any questions or anything along these lines.